Do y'all remember that 6-month period after Jeff Sessions but before Bill Barr when the Attorney General of the United States was named Matthew Whitaker? I didn't. That and more as we revisit 2018, the second year of Trump's first term in office. We're back with the second episode of our series looking back at each year of Trump's first term in office. Now, if you haven't seen our episode on the first year, I highly recommend that you go back and watch it because it does actually provide a good amount of context to what happened in 2018. As a reminder, we're prioritizing the things that Trump actually did or the actions that actually came out of the administration and not the things that he said. It's really jarring how much controversy comes out of this administration simply from things that he says and how few of those things actually turn into actions or correlate with any policy decisions that are made by the administration. I think there's a lot of legitimacy to this idea that his approval ratings would actually be quite a bit higher right now if he would just shut up more often. But that doesn't mean that 2018 was good. It wasn't that good, but there's a lot to go over, so let's get into it. 2018 was dominated by coverage about immigration, and for good reason. This is the year that we learned about Trump's zero tolerance policy, which separated thousands of children from their parents at the southern US border. It was also the year that Trump tried to make immigrants traveling through Southern and Central America to the US border a major campaign issue in order to scare Americans into voting for Republicans in the 2018 midterm elections. In an act that he hoped would dissuade immigrants from attempting to cross the Southern US border at the same time as pressuring legislators into passing stricter immigration laws, in 2018, Donald Trump publicly and officially announced the zero tolerance policy. However, separating families at the border indiscriminately had been happening for over a year at that point. Under this policy, families that were caught trying to cross the southern border were separated. Adults were prosecuted and put in federal jails. The children of those adults became wards of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and they were held in jail-like facilities at the southern border. By January of this year, the SPLC reports that over 4,300 children were separated from their parents. Up until this administration, children were only held in facilities like this when the adults that they crossed the border with already had criminal records in the US, or if they crossed the border unattended. And even then, they were only held in these facilities until they were able to be placed elsewhere. In June, it became public that the administration had not made it part of their policy to try and reunite children with their parents. I don't think I need to tell you why this is bad, but in effect, it meant that it was US immigration policy to orphan children at the US border. And what was worse is, if you remember from last week's video, it was just a year before this that Trump was trying to outlaw DACA, which means that he was creating situations where children were orphaned in America against their will without any legal protections of randomly being deported later on, all the while having no idea where their parents were, even if they were in this country or not, in jail or not. Not only was this inhumane, but it showed a shocking lack of foresight. It was cruel and completely unnecessary, not to mention incompetent. By the end of June, Trump had signed an executive order ending the zero tolerance policy. However, hundreds of children have been separated from their parents since. He later admitted that the main purpose for this was to deter immigration across the US border and to provide an incentive for lawmakers to change immigration laws, which is absolutely ridiculous. Immigration law should happen in DC among politicians, not at the border. We can argue back and forth all we want about who should be allowed to come into this country, but in the meantime, it is paramount that we prioritize the humane treatment of people in the US, regardless of whether or not they are immigrants. Children died in these facilities. They died. And it's absolutely abhorrent. Shortly after child separation dominated the news cycles, Trump began flooding the zone with fear-mongering about a caravan of migrants traveling through Central America to the US border. Now, these caravans weren't exactly new. They were a growing alternative to families individually hiring coyotes to try and get them over the border. They hoped that traveling in a large group and going and attempting to work through the system together was a safer and less exploitative alternative to hiring these coyotes. But Trump exploited them anyway, just for a slightly different purpose. He essentially manufactured a border crisis in an attempt to scare people into voting for Republicans in that year's midterm election. It's worth noting, though, that a majority of Americans did not buy into this, and they rejected the messaging at the polls. Then, conveniently, after Republicans lost in the election, we didn't hear about migrant caravans anymore. In general, in 2018, immigration served as yet another example of how difficult it is for Donald Trump to see people as people. For someone who first and foremost recognizes the humanity in others, they simply wouldn't be able to subject people to this sort of treatment primarily for political purposes. Trump spent so much time in 2018 trying to demonize these people simply because he thought it was politically expedient. It's a disturbing trend that we saw leading up to this point, and unfortunately, it's one that's continued since. Alright, moving away from the human rights tragedies, 2018 is also when Trump established the America First trade policies. In January, the administration placed tariffs on washing machines and solar panels. In March, they added tariffs to steel and aluminum. In June, they extended the tariffs to the EU, Canada, and Mexico. And in July, they announced separate tariffs on goods from China. And just like that, we were in a trade war. Studies have shown that these tariffs reduced income adjusted for inflation in the United States and had an adverse effect on GDP. CNBC also produced an analysis that the tariffs equated to one of the largest tax increases since the 90s, equal to 0.34% of GDP. The tariffs also led to the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA. Now, Trump markets the USMCA as some terrific improvement over NAFTA. However, the agreements are extremely similar. The IMF projects that the effects on the economy will be negligible, but it does provide for some more data sharing between the countries. However, at the end of the day, it's pretty hard to argue that it was worth all the negative effects on consumers from the tariffs themselves. Then there was the stamp that Trump put on foreign military engagements. In May, Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. In June, he began negotiations with Kim Jong-un about his nuclear program. And by the end of the year, Trump had ordered the Pentagon to draw up plans to withdraw from Syria and Afghanistan. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, also known as the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal, was an agreement between Iran and Russia, China, France, Germany, the US, and the UK that would limit their nuclear capabilities and prevent Iran from producing a nuclear weapon in exchange for economic sanction relief. Trump's problem with the deal was never all that clear because his particular objections were never really rooted in facts about the deal, similar to the Paris Agreement. Either way, Trump's withdrawal and subsequent escalations have resulted in the situation that we have now, where there is no nuclear agreement in place and Iran's nuclear future is uncertain. Trump also became quite infatuated with Kim Jong-un during this time. The relationship was pretty on again, off again until June when they finally met in Singapore. This was more or less the beginnings of the negotiations between President Trump and the dictator of North Korea about his nuclear program. The two came to an agreement that resulted in the release of some American prisoners from North Korea, as well as the return of American soldiers' remains. In exchange, North Korea got some security guarantees, they got a commitment for us to stop some joint military exercises with South Korea, and they got some sweet photo ops. But to this day, there has been no progress made on the nuclear front. Also in 2018, Trump became very aggressive in the Middle East. In April, in response to some chemical strikes by the Syrian government, the US, France, and UK executed airstrikes on chemical compounds in Syria. At the same time, throughout 2017 and 2018, Trump had enabled Defense Secretary Jim Mattis to be very successful in beating back the Islamic Caliphate. This was legitimately a good development. However, later in 2018, much to the surprise of the military, to Congress, and to civilian advisors, Trump announced that he would be withdrawing from the region. In a bit of a mission accomplished moment of his own, he declared that ISIL was defeated, even though it definitely wasn't. This resulted in the resignation of Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, which brings us to our last theme of 2018, and that's personnel turnover. 2018 is when we really started to get a complete sense of what Trump's philosophy around personnel management is, and that's to demand fealty. And if somebody refuses to give it to you, you push them out and you replace them with somebody who will be loyal to you without question or criticism. This, in combination with all of the people who were fired or had to resign because of controversy, resulted in a ton of turnover in the White House. Now, I'm going to try to get through this truncated list pretty quickly, so forgive me for reading from my notes. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis resigns after failing to convince Trump to reconsider pulling out of Syria. Jeff Sessions, Attorney General, resigns after public bickering with the president over his recusal from the Russia investigations. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is fired via tweet. National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster is fired after publicly affirming that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Chief of Staff John Kelly resigns after his relationship with the president devolves to the point that they are no longer on speaking terms. Chief Economic Advisor Gary Cohn resigns in March in opposition to Trump's trade wars. Administrator of the EPA Scott Pruitt resigns after it becomes public that he is under 14 separate corruptions investigations. White House counsel Don McGahn resigns in October after several disagreements about which of his enemies Donald Trump can have the DOJ prosecute. Ambassador to the UN Nikki Haley resigns in December. Homeland Security advisors Tom Bossert and Michael Anton resign shortly after John Bolton becomes National Security Advisor. Undersecretary of Veteran Affairs David Shulkin is fired via Twitter. White House Staff Secretary Rob Porter resigns after it becomes public that he has a habit of beating his wives and girlfriends. And finally, White House Communications Director Hope Hicks resigns after admitting during a congressional hearing that she sometimes lies to the public. Seriously, this is far from an exhaustive list. It is mind-numbing how much turnover in this administration there has been. All right, again, before we go, I'm going to give you my favorite thing to come out of this administration during 2018, and that is without a doubt the First Steps Act. I legitimately think that this is very good legislation, and I'm really happy that Donald Trump signed it. This is a bipartisan congressional effort that goes way back to the Obama administration. Unfortunately, Mitch McConnell was not willing to bring it up for a vote while a Democrat was president. When a Republican became president, he was willing to vote on it, and it passed. And it's a good thing it passed. It does very important things like reduce mandatory minimums for nonviolent crimes. It bans the shackling of pregnant inmates. It bans the use of solitary confinement on juveniles and much more. It could go a lot farther, and I hope Congress will go farther. I specifically hope that Republicans still care about this issue when a Democrat is president. But again, like the title of the bill says, this is a first step. Mass incarceration and over-incarceration is a huge problem in America, and I'm really happy that this Congress did something, anything to address it. Man, that was a really hard one. 2018 was a lot. There is so much that I didn't get to touch on, but I hope you enjoyed the second episode of this little series that we're doing. The first one got a lot of great positive engagement, so please, I encourage you to share this video with anyone who you think might be interested, especially for folks who are on the fence about who to vote for in November. I'm in Texas this weekend. I'm going to go see some friends, so we had to record this one at a weird time. I hope you didn't get too distracted by all of the lighting changes that happened. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel so that you can make sure and catch the next episodes in this series. If you haven't already, go ahead and check out the video about 2017, or if you're bored, check out this video about what the swing states might be in this year's election. Thanks again. Like the video, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you next Sunday.